The triumph of the Alliance to restore the Republic over the Galactic Empire was undoubtedly one of the most astonishing and spectacular in all history. That a scattered coalition of freedom fighters could bring about the dissolution of the most powerful military institution ever created was in many ways an impossible feat. But against every odd, it was achieved through the unlikely convergence of various groups and individuals, their initial tenuous efforts growing in size and capability until the momentum of the rebellion was all but unstoppable. The New Republic was proclaimed even as the fires of the Galactic Civil War still raged. While this new nation would ultimately bring the conflict to a successful resolution and prevent the scattered Imperial remnants from reforming into a cohesive bloc, this would be its only major geopolitical success. In the years and decades following its victory over the Empire, the New Republic seemed unable to preserve in peacetime what it had fought to achieve in war. Its policies lacked ambition. Its democratic institutions fell into infighting. While it outwardly aspired to reinvigorate the galaxy and bring about a return of the golden era known to history as the High Republic, its capabilities and territories would never approach those of its predecessors. Ultimately, the New Republic would last just a few years longer than the empire it had overthrown. It was destroyed by the First Order roughly 3 decades after its declaration, dissolving seemingly overnight. In the history of the galaxy, the New Republic, founded by the Rebellion, became nothing more than a historical footnote. I don't think many people will disagree with me when I say that the New Republic didn't work. It was destroyed in an instant after all, which is not exactly the mark of an effective interstellar government. But if we look into why it didn't work, what series of decisions and circumstances transformed a rebellion that had achieved victory over the Galactic Empire into a republic seemingly incapable of defending itself, things get rather complicated. Previously, the Templin Institute similarly declared that the First Order didn't work, and this video is very much something of a follow-up to that one. But what I find most interesting is that while I don't think either the First Order or the New Republic worked, when we compare why, they're for reasons that are almost the exact opposite from one another. The First Order was supposed to be intimidating, but had a self-defeating government structure, an inefficient military apparatus, and failed to learn the lessons of the Galactic Civil War. And yet, despite all of this, it seemed to march from success to success, like the rules of the universe didn't apply to it. As a consequence, the First Order didn't make much sense, it didn't feel believable, and it failed to be interesting. But where the First Order didn't seem to fit within the context of the galaxy it inhabited, I don't think we can say the same about the New Republic. Yeah, the New Republic didn't last very long, but the circumstances behind its decline and collapse make perfect sense, and fit just fine within the greater state of the galaxy. It lost, but it played by the rules of the universe it was within. But it's easy to look at so many of the decisions and policies the New Republic enacted and declare definitively that they made the wrong choice or took the wrong path. But we can say this with the benefit of hindsight. When I try to put myself in the mindset of the New Republic's leadership, without the knowledge of future events, I can't help but think I might have made the exact same choices if I was in their position. Not in every instance, mind you. There are certainly moments where the New Republic definitely should have realized they were making the wrong choice, but not so many where I don't think maybe we can't cut the New Republic a little slack. To put all this simply, unlike the First Order, the New Republic doesn't work not because it was internally inconsistent and nonsensical, but because the New Republic simply found itself in the wrong place at the wrong time, and then exploded.
I have never exploded, but I know what it would be like. Don't ask me how, I just know. I've always just known.
I don't know whether someone close to Garth had exploded, whether it was a colleague or a pet. But you could tell that scene meant a lot to him. There were tears on set, not from Garth, he was strong for the crew.
So the full title of this video could be, The New Republic Doesn't Work, but maybe that's the point. With that in mind, on this episode of Incoming, I'm going to attempt to explain my position. We'll run through a few of the New Republic's more controversial decisions, and I'll either defend the choices they made or do my best to explain why they should have known better, or more likely, do a bit of both. Let's start right at the beginning. One of the first major controversial decisions the New Republic made was the way in which they decided to end the Galactic Civil War. Rather than destroying the Galactic Empire completely, they allowed it to continue to exist in a few scattered rump states. Was this a mistake? Now, I don't know all the terms included in the Galactic Concordance that ended the war, but it does seem like the Galactic Empire signed some sort of conditional surrender. On the one hand, this seems like a major mistake on the part of the New Republic. Momentum was on their side, they had the initiative, so why not insist on an unconditional surrender? It's true that had the Galactic Empire surrendered unconditionally, the New Republic could have dictated, well, whatever they wanted. Forget allowing remnants of the Empire to exist across the galaxy, these could have all been dissolved in a single stroke, and the Republic would have never needed to worry about them ever again. But there's actually a pretty strong argument in defending the New Republic's choice here. At the time the Concordance was signed, the New Republic definitely had a military advantage over the Empire, but there was no guarantee that would continue to be the case. The exact strength of each side is difficult to estimate, but the New Republic was almost certainly still numerically inferior. Its success was only possible because the Imperial military was beginning to fracture, and the New Republic was facing disorganized units as opposed to a single united front. There's this idea in military strategy that it never hurts to leave your enemy a way out. Not usually literally, but rather something to incentivize them to lay down their arms and stop resisting. A conditional surrender can be that way out. Stop fighting the New Republic, recognize our legitimacy over the galaxy, and we'll throw your way a few star systems. You can still be in charge, you can even still call yourselves the Galactic Empire if you want. If you're an Imperial Moff or Grand Admiral, that might not sound like such a bad deal. But if the New Republic had demanded a complete unconditional surrender, that way out is now blocked. Any Imperial Moff or Admiral or whatever would have absolutely no incentive to stop fighting, and would probably call upon their stormtroopers to die to the last man. And that might not be the kind of war the New Republic could even win. They could have easily found themselves in an endless quagmire, fighting wars of attrition against every Imperial remnant in the galaxy. These remnants might have grown so fractured that even if the New Republic decided they wanted peace, there would no longer be any unified empire to accept it. Or the exact opposite might have happened. That demand of unconditional surrender might have incited the remaining Imperial forces to finally get their act together and unite their scattered units into a more coherent military force, one that might have been able to regain the initiative and turn the course of the war. Faced with either possibility, it definitely makes sense to me that the New Republic would want to secure an armistice as quickly as possible. And as we'll get into later on, the rebellion never seemed to be the most centralized institution.
What is she proposing? Just let the girl speak.
And the New Republic was likely very similar in those first few years. Just as it wasn't a sure thing that the Imperial military would remain on the back foot forever, it was equally possible that the New Republic itself might begin to fracture. Would every single member world of the New Republic be willing to continue the fighting for however long it took to force an unconditional surrender? It's hard to say, but taking into account the eventual fate of the New Republic, the answer is probably no. With all that considered, I think the New Republic's approach to the Imperial surrender was actually handled pretty well. They waited until the situation was as favorable as it was likely to become, and then pushed forward the best peace treaty they could reasonably expect. They removed any incentive Imperial commanders might have to resist at all costs, and prevented their consolidation under a single unifying figure. So many times across history, a potential victory has turned into a very real defeat because one side has refused to accept anything less than total victory. I have to give the New Republic credit in avoiding this mistake. It's an oddly calculated move for a regime that always seemed to rely more on emotion. That said, I think the New Republic did make a few smaller mistakes in handling the Imperial surrender. The first is that under the terms of the treaty, they labeled every Imperial officer who didn't submit to the Galactic Concordance a war criminal. On the surface, this might make sense. I mean, what else do you call those who don't follow the law? They're criminals. But this is a tricky topic. Surrenders are a complicated confluence of military, political, and legal elements. They're heavily dependent on circumstance and context.
My general says there is no point in continuing this fighting. He is willing to discuss a surrender.
We haven't the proper facilities to take you all prisoner. Sorry.
What?
We'd like to, but we can't accept your surrender. Was there anything else?
So ignoring all of that in favor of a blanket statement that labels an entire group war criminals seems too broad and far-reaching. If, for example, an imperial unit refused to surrender or didn't accept the legitimacy of the order to surrender, but otherwise acted within the established rules of war, is that in itself enough to immediately label them war criminals? I talked before about how it never hurts to leave your enemy a way out, but in this case, anyone who didn't immediately surrender has had that way out taken away. What incentive do they have to surrender a week, a month, or a year after the fighting has stopped? This is almost like something the Galactic Empire would have proclaimed instead. Only the Sith deal in absolutes after all. It is a tricky subject though, so if we have any experts of international law in the comments, please let me know. Now, the next part where the Republic might have made a misstep when drafting the Galactic Concordance is the limitations, or lack thereof, on the surviving Imperial military. One of the conditions of the surrender is that the recruitment and mobilization of stormtroopers was forbidden. The wording there is a little strange. They're allowed to have stormtroopers, but not to mobilize them? How do you define mobilization? But the other aspect to this was that the Imperial Navy was allowed to remain intact so long as it didn't venture outside its new borders. Why cripple the Stormtrooper Corps only to allow the Navy near free reign? The latter definitely seems like the larger threat after all, while the former is more what you'd need to maintain stability. A better solution, it seems to me, would have been to put restrictions on both. The Imperial remnants would still needed to have a military force to provide security within their territory, but it should not have been capable of offensive action. Fewer restrictions on the stormtroopers and more on the Navy would have probably resulted in a better situation for both sides. But once the surrender was signed, the New Republic was now free to focus on its internal affairs. But the nature of its government is again one of those controversial elements. When compared to the Galactic Empire, its political structure was decentralized, with weaker executive powers and a greater emphasis placed on local governance over federal authority. To many people, this wasn't a desirable outcome. Critics say that the New Republic was unable to effectively govern and politically weak. But I think this is one of those moments where the New Republic was forced to simply choose the least bad option. Even if its leaders had wanted a more centralized system, the new government found itself in a difficult spot for two major reasons. The first is that the rule of the Galactic Empire was so corrupt and destructive that anything associated with it, no matter how benign it might be in isolation, became poisonous in the minds of the New Republic citizens. Concepts like political centralization, galaxy-spanning infrastructure, equality before the law, a strong military, feelings of national pride and patriotism are not inherently evil by any means. They might even be necessary within any state that wants to govern a territory the size of the galaxy. The problem is, all those societal elements had been manipulated to serve the Empire to such an extent that the New Republic had no choice but to distance themselves from them in order to survive. If anyone in the New Republic's leadership had even come close to saying something like, well, obviously Palpatine took things a little too far, but he had some good ideas, so trust us, we'll get it right this time. Well, they wouldn't have lasted that long at all. Even if Jedi Master Luke Skywalker himself had looked into the heart of the Force and said definitively, the New Republic needs a strong central government, there was no way it was going to happen. It was absolutely inevitable that some kind of decentralization and reform was going to take place. The second reason why the New Republic was in a difficult spot was that its leadership seemed to lack a strong vision for what this government was supposed to be. The Alliance loved to declare that its rebellion was built on hope. But a hope for what exactly? The answer to that might change pretty drastically from rebel to rebel. While many were fighting specifically to establish the New Republic, How many agreed completely on what form that new republic would take? And plenty of others within the rebellion just wanted the Empire gone. There were many rebellious worlds out there who were understandably sick and tired of being part of any galactic government, and saw the fall of the Empire as an opportunity to just go their own way. It should be no surprise then that the New Republic was only a fraction of the size of what had come before. The rebellion was a diverse coalition of many different groups, one destined to splinter as soon as their only unifying goal was achieved. So these two major factors limited the scope of what the New Republic could become pretty much immediately. But it's worth noting that everything up to this point was hardly their fault. It was just the sabak hand they were dealt. That said though, they didn't play those cards particularly well either. The government system they ended up with, rather than address these limitations and work to overcome them, seemed to instead play right into them, or ended up contradicting their own established goals. And this is where we can start casting some blame. This quote from Senator Leia Organa sums things up pretty well. After Palpatine, nobody wanted to hand over that much power again, so we don't have an executive, only a chancellor with no real authority. Now, I'm not exactly sure what she means by this. My understanding is that executive power is inherent to any government structure, not something you can just get rid of. Whatever you end up calling it, without any institution to enforce the law and govern the state, well, you don't have a government. It's like saying you want to build a skyscraper, but you don't want there to be a top floor. What I think Leia is instead saying is that the New Republic has a fusion of powers. Now, for those of you who need a refresher course, every government features different branches. Most often, these are the executive, legislative, and judicial, but there can be more and sometimes less. When there is a fusion of powers, different branches, usually the executive and legislative, intermingle. Often the head of state is more of a ceremonial position, while the head of the government is also a member of the legislature. This is contrasted by the separation of powers, in which each branch is entirely separate with its own independent powers and responsibilities. Where it gets confusing is that when you look at the advantages and disadvantages of each system, then what Leia insinuated doesn't make any sense. Proponents of the fusion of powers will tell you that the main benefit to the system is that the deadlock between the different branches of government can be avoided. The chief executive is accountable to the legislature and can be discharged by a vote of no confidence. Now, it might seem like the executive branch would be pretty weak under this arrangement, forever on the leash of the legislature. Paradoxically, the opposite is often true. If the head of the government, a chancellor like the one Leia described, needs to maintain the support of several political parties working together as part of a coalition, then yeah, the system works. But what happens if one political party comes to dominate the legislature? And what if the head of government, the chancellor appointed by that party, is really charismatic and particularly skilled at enforcing discipline amongst his supporters? Well, suddenly, you have a chief executive who can use his party to prevent his office from being accountable to the legislature, while at the same time getting his party to pass into law whatever the chancellor wants. Does this sound at all familiar?
It is with great reluctance that I have agreed to this calling. I love democracy. I love the Republic.
It seems to me that in trying to reform the government of the Old Republic, the New Republic instead just repeated the exact same mistakes. Ironically, if the New Republic possessed a strong executive branch, but one counterbalanced by a strong legislature and judiciary, the chances that any branch would come to dominate the others is effectively removed. This is the main advantage of having a separation of powers. Each branch limits the capabilities of the others. Of course, then you run the risk of having the associated gridlock, but hey, that's the price of freedom. Now, to be fair...
Don't say to be fair. Hate when people say to be fair. It sounds like, to be fair.
To be fair.
Well, to be fair.
The details of the New Republic's government remain sparse, and there's a chance I misinterpreted Senator Leia's quote there. And government systems with the fusion of powers can include various additional checks and balances to prevent any abuse of power. I mean, the government of modern Germany features a fusion of powers and they, more so than most, have a vested interest in preventing the rise of a potential dictator. But with the limited information available, it does seem like the New Republic got the worst of all worlds here. Political gridlock, a weak executive branch, and the potential for one party to dominate the system. In short, the New Republic found itself in a difficult situation, but failed to mitigate the weaknesses of the political system they were forced into adopting. Before I move on from the political side of things, there's one other element I wanted to discuss. I'm not sure if it's particularly controversial or not, but that's the location of the New Republic's capital. In contrast to the Galactic Empire, who selected the traditional galactic seat of power, Coruscant, the New Republic had a rotating capital chosen from among its member worlds. This isn't the worst idea in the galaxy. A common criticism directed towards the Old Republic was that it was too focused on the affairs of the core worlds, leaving the rest of the galaxy underrepresented. But the question then becomes, does a rotating capital do anything to address this issue, or is it just an empty symbolic gesture? It's hard to say either way, but even if this approach did help bind the New Republic together in some tangible way, it probably wasn't enough to justify the immense expense of moving the federal capital every few years. I think it would have been much more interesting if a new capital was built from the ground up, somewhere in the mid-rim. A major, ambitious project that the galaxy could follow the progress of and rally around. Okay, but let's move on. The next major point of contention within the New Republic was the dramatic demobilization of its military following the end of the Galactic Civil War. And just to get ahead of some potential misinformation out there, the New Republic did wait until the war was over. They didn't start scrapping their ships while they might still have needed them. But once the conflict was over, as part of a law called the Military Disarmament Act, the New Republic armed forces were reduced to about 10% of their peak wartime strength. Instead, the New Republic would fund its member worlds to raise and maintain their own individual armed forces. Knowing the eventual fate of the New Republic, this definitely seems like a terrible move. But it makes a lot more sense when you take into account the situation at the time. The Galactic Civil War was over, and the need for large fleets and armies was seemingly gone with it. The only potential foreign rivals at this time were the Imperial remnants, who were unlikely to be able to start a new war anytime soon, and the traditional criminal element against which conventional forces could only do so much. But even if the New Republic had wanted or even needed a large military, this was never a realistic option. Just as the Galactic Empire had poisoned the idea of centralized authority, a large, standing military was just too associated with the Imperial regime to be politically viable. We talked previously about how the New Republic was dealt a bad hand. It played that hand poorly with regards to its government, but with its military, I think it made the right move. By using the funding that would have gone towards its own federally controlled military to instead support planetary defense forces, the New Republic was able to field larger forces than it might have been otherwise capable. By leaving the size and capability of these planetary forces in the hands of local governments, the New Republic was essentially immune to any criticism that it was repeating the militarism of the Galactic Empire. If Corellia, for example, was dealing with a bunch of pirates, they could petition the Senate to fund the Corellian Starfleet. And if people were upset at the size of that Starfleet, well, the New Republic was simply responding to a request of a local government. Take it up with Corellia. I think this was a great short-term solution, especially when you consider just how much of a mishmash the rebellion's military forces were. So much of its equipment was donated or salvaged by various groups and never really meant to work together. A large-scale restructuring was necessary to consolidate these elements, and this would have been all the easier if the military was reduced in size. As a long-term solution, I think you'd run into some problems though. This kind of arrangement would only work if every world was completely dedicated to the concept of collective security, an attack on one being an attack on all. Again, when we look at the eventual fate of the New Republic, this doesn't seem to have been the case, which leads me to my last point. A common exercise I do when trying to determine if something makes sense, whether it works or not, is to recontextualize it within our own world. And I think everything we've talked about up to this point with the New Republic should be very familiar to us. It struggled to emerge from a devastating conflict, the political gridlock and instability that followed, the bad hand it was dealt. We've seen these sorts of things time and time again here on Earth. The presidency of John Adams, interwar France, the Weimar Republic, these all come to mind. But where I think we begin to drift from the realm of the plausible is in the lead up to the New Republic's brief war with the First Order. The lack of firm details surrounding the rise of the First Order and its early relationship with the New Republic makes any analysis difficult. But at the very least, we can definitively say that the New Republic's government was aware of this growing threat, well before the destruction of the Hosnian system. Despite this, it was too preoccupied with its own internal issues to give the First Order the attention it deserved. Part of this makes sense to me. Again, how many times in our own world has a threat been ignored until it was too late? But the New Republic was founded by a military organization dedicated to the destruction of tyranny. This would be at the core of its national identity and something ingrained in every citizen. I just can't believe that the New Republic would become so feeble and unwilling to act in its own defense so quickly. All the admirals and generals and soldiers who fought in the Galactic Civil War, they're still around. They're probably in positions of authority, so where did that resolve go? It might be tempting to compare the fall of the New Republic to the fall of France in 1940. As previously mentioned, you can see a lot of the same elements in each. But there's a few issues with this. The first is that while it was ultimately unsuccessful, France did engage in a last-ditch effort to build up its military forces, while the New Republic seems to have resisted any military buildup until its final moments. And compared to France, the New Republic was also in a much stronger position. It hadn't suffered the same catastrophic losses in the Galactic Civil War as France did in World War I, and even if it didn't match the same territorial extent as the Old Republic, it was still exponentially larger and more powerful than the First Order. To me, this seems more like if the United States had surrendered immediately after the attack on Pearl Harbor. There seems to be this strange idea that democracies are decadent, weak, unsuited to the rigors of war. This is simply not true. The Free French forces never stopped their campaign to rid the world of fascism. American troops endured some of the most terrible battlefields possible, and we should have seen the same determination within the New Republic. Freedom is the sure possession of those alone who have the courage to defend it. And no matter how dire the circumstance, no matter how flawed democracy might be, there will always be people of courage. I have no doubt that the First Order could have delivered an unexpected and sizable blow to the New Republic. I can accept that the New Republic's military policy might have encouraged individual member worlds or sectors to pursue a separate peace. But even with all its disadvantages, I can't help but feel that there was still enough power left in the New Republic to put up more of a fight. Maybe the New Republic was simply unable to win that war, but to lose it so quickly, I don't buy it. Now, this is usually where we'd end things. But just like with the First Order, the Templin Institute is going to attempt a bit of an experiment. On Thursday, October 7th, we'll be releasing a follow-up video where we're going to redesign the New Republic. As if through science or magic, we were somehow put in charge of its development and had to come up with something both plausible and interesting. But of course, all this is just my opinion. And even though I was elected the Chancellor of Truth in a free and fair election, I'd like to hear your thoughts. Should the New Republic have pursued an unconditional surrender? Should they have never demilitarized? Are all democracies overindulgent and decadent? Let me know in the comments below, and until next time, this has been Incoming. In Incoming, the Templin Institute discusses the theories and ideas found across alternate worlds. Join other Templin Institute personnel on our Discord server, where discussions are held daily on the elements of world building, spaceship design, the best method of cooking rice, and other critical issues affecting alternate worlds. You'll find a link in the description.